Quando era adolescente, Dean Kamen não chegou a completar o curso de engenharia. Ele diz que o ensino nos Estados Unidos não ajuda a criatividade. E isso se tornou uma missão para ele: estimular o surgimento de novos gênios da tecnologia. Uma competição de ciência que Kamen começou com algumas crianças e hoje está espalhada pelo mundo.
"15 years ago, it seemed to me that too many kids, especially in the rich world, where they have so many distractions to play with by the time they're any age, too many kids in the developed world were shying away from science and technology, even at a young age. Particularly women and minorities in the U.S. would never think about careers in science and technology, engineering, inventing. By the time you're 6 or 7 or 8 years old in this country, all of your role models come from Hollywood, entertainment, or sports. And if you're a woman or minority, it's the NBA, the NFL, Hollywood, that's it. So as an inventor, I looked at that problem and saw it differently than everybody else that saw the problem. Industry, education, government all saw this problem as supply. We need more teachers, more books, more computers, more standards, more tests. Everybody saw this as an education problem. We looked at this problem and said, it's not a supply problem, it's a demand problem. So I said, we're going to form an organization that turns science and technology into sport. And just like kids are turned on to sports, not by seeing their other little kids bouncing balls, but they'd seen Shaquille O'Neal. They have to see the best of the best. I went back 15 years ago and found some of the biggest technology companies in the world: Boeing, Intel, Johnson & Johnson, United Technologies, Motorola, Xerox. We went to 23 of the biggest companies in the world and said, give us a couple of your engineers to work nights and weekends for 6 weeks, just like any other 6-week high school sports season. Let them adopt a local high school. Let them bring these kids out. We're going to give you a kit of parts. You're going to have to build a robot. At the end of 6 weeks, we're all going to get together at a big tournament. We'll have literally a technology fest. We'll let these robots compete with each other in a double elimination tournament, 2-minute rounds. Bring the school bands. Bring the cheerleaders. Let's have a good time. 23 companies adopted 23 schools from all over the country. They all flew right here to Manchester, New Hampshire. We put them in a high school gym. They had a great tournament. At the end of the tournament, I asked all the CEOs and presidents and technology officers of these giant companies, would you do this again? Every one of those 23 companies said, this was the toughest thing we did, Dean. In 6 weeks, we had to work nights and weekends. But you didn't tell us that our companies would get more out of it than the kids. You didn't tell us that these engineers would become heroes for these kids. You didn't tell us that these kids would be permanently changed once they saw what real scientists and engineers could do. And it breaks all the stereotypes about engineering. So yes, we'll come back because we need these kids. We need the next generation.
O FIRST, sigla do movimento que em português se traduz em Inspiração e Reconhecimento da Ciência e Tecnologia, tem hoje 13 mil escolas participantes. O Brasil terá 14 equipes disputando a final regional em março em São José dos Campos, São Paulo. A usina de ideias de Dean Kamen não para. Ele está criando braços semibiônicos para soldados mutilados. Tem testado um propulsor a ar que arremessará policiais de tropa de elite até o topo de prédios.
Between the why not and how do I do that, how does your mind work?
That's a very good question to which I have a very poor answer because I don't know. I ask myself the question all the time because if you knew how to invent, if you knew how to make the leap that nobody else has made yet, if you could study that and improve on that process, you wouldn't just have golden eggs. That would be the golden goose. I don't know how to do that. I can tell you a few things we always try to do to be able to innovate. Number one, rather than first looking at what is the technology we're going to play with here, and then say, how can we use this new technology? Instead, we look at the problem, and we try to look at the same problem everybody else looks at, but see it differently. And if you look at the problem in a different way, then it draws you to using a different pool of technologies to try to solve it. So the first thing we do is try to restate the problem, as opposed to look at the same problem everybody else is looking at and trying to find a different solution. Mostly, if you look at the problem the same way, you state it the same way, other people are pretty smart. They've been there, they've done that. You're going to come up with some variation on what they have done. Besides trying to restate the problem and see it differently, the other thing we frankly try to do is do things that are so bold that we all know in our heart of hearts they'll probably fail. Most people, especially little kids, will try anything, and they don't mind failing. They really don't. They pick themselves up, they try again. By the time you're an adult, you've learned. You've learned from parents, you've learned from school, you've learned from your employees. You've learned failure's a bad thing. You've learned how to not fail. And most people have learned pretty well how to do that, which is why the world's such a stable place. Not too many people make really big failures. The problem is you never know how much opportunity you're missing by always spending so much time avoiding failure. Take small steps. Be careful. Be cautious. Around DECA, at the end of the day, I like to see one of two things happen. A spectacular success or a spectacular failure. I'd rather see the successes, and they don't come as often. But frankly, a really big failure? Wow, we won't do that again, and we really learned from that. Scratch that. Let's try the next one. But if you're willing to try big stuff and willing to fail, every once in a while you try a big thing, and it succeeds. And that's a big deal.
Your father was an illustrator.
Yes, he is. Still is.
How did that influence you in terms of the mind's eye?
When I was a kid, I used to think he was not a big influence. And as an adult, I'm embarrassed to admit this, a woman who's a PhD in industrial psychology. Industrial psychology sat in that chair actually to interview me for some university program they were doing, analyzing corporate organization for the purpose of innovation. She was from a major university. And she said, I've been talking to 3M, IBM, GM, some government labs, and looking at matrix organizations and different kinds of organizations. And she said, but we really wanted to come to DECA to see how this R&D company is organized because you seem to do a lot of innovation, and we're trying to understand why. And I said, fine. The next thing she says to me, I've done a little research. She was a PhD. She's a researcher. And so I understand, based on what I know about your father, that he must have had a big influence on what you do. And I said, oh, no. My father couldn't be more opposite of me. I'm a mathematician, a physicist. My father's an artist. My father creates art. I don't have any artistic talent. I do mathematics and physics because I can't draw. My father couldn't be less of a business person. My mother, taught business in high school. My mother keeps my books. My mother took care of my father's work. He's an artist. We couldn't be more different. I said that because I believed it. This woman, who I had only met 5 minutes earlier, says to me, Dean, your father was a creative guy. He happened to use different tools than you. You're a creative guy. Your father was self-employed. He might have had your mother keep the books, but he got up every day, never got a paycheck. He worked for himself. He was a freelance illustrator. It's very rare that somebody works for himself and doesn't have a job. Your father got up every day, created things that either the world would buy or they wouldn't. And that's how he made his living. From what I understand, you, DECA, get up every day and make stuff that either the world will accept or not. You are an extension precisely of your father. And I had never thought of that. I had never thought of that. So I'm a bad judge of that. I have now come to realize my father was an enormous influence on my life.
You don't seem to be getting old in your brain.
To me, old is when you'd rather think about what you once were or what you once did or how things used to be. Young is when every day you get up thinking about how are we going to do more and how are we going to be better tomorrow. People always ask me, what's the best thing we ever did? And I always say, I don't know, it didn't happen yet, because I'm not old. And every time we have a success, it gives us more knowledge and more resources, so we take on a bigger project. So the way to stay young is always think about what you're going to do tomorrow, not what you did yesterday. And that's the way I live life.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Se você quiser saber mais sobre esse e outros assuntos do Espaço Aberto Ciência e Tecnologia, acesse o nosso site www.globo.com/globonews. Até a próxima!